Good evening, everybody. I'm here to say a few words of welcome on behalf of the Centre of Urban and Built Ecology, CUBE for short. This is an event in our annual series, and we're obviously delighted to be having this book event for Nick Temple and Christian Frost. We've been talking about it for a while, and now here we finally are. I'm giving these words of introduction on behalf of CUBE and also the School of Art, Architecture and Design on behalf of the Dean, who will hopefully join us later. We are going to be recording this event on Panopto and also a little phone over there, which I will add later on. At the end of the event, I will be running around with a mobile, with a roving microphone to capture your questions. So if you have questions, please wait for the microphone. But that's jumping ahead. Before I get on to introducing the chair of this evening, I want to tell you that the toilets are downstairs, and if you hear an alarm, a fire alarm, it is not a drill, so please follow the exit signs to the exit. Right, that's it from me. I had some notes to introduce this evening's chair, who is Professor Max Sternberg, who I know very well because we studied our PhDs together at the University of Cambridge some decades ago. Max, in fact, has been a friend of ours and of the school for some time. So it's great to welcome him back tonight to chair this event. He has authored numerous publications on various, first on his specialization in Cistercian architecture, more recently themes to do with cities in conflict, and also a variety of other areas of interest, which he will share with you. Max.
Thanks, Matthew. Can you hear me? Is that all right? Great. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to introduce you two, Nick and Christian. Since I was a very green postdoc, shortly after studying with Matthew, I started following your work and admired it greatly. So it's an honor to introduce you both. So I think we have an hour and a half or so. I'll introduce both of you simultaneously. Then I think Nick is presenting first and Christian. You'll speak for 15 to 20 minutes each. Then we'll sit up front, and I might start with a couple of questions, but then very quickly we'll open the floor to questions. And also there are physical copies of the book here in front. If you haven't already inspected them, please have a look. I think there's a code as well for a discount. And Christian's book is coming out as a paperback before long, so that's another thing to look forward to if the hardback is too expensive, which it tends to be, I admit. Right, so I'll first introduce Christian, as it were, in reverse order. So Christian is an architect and academic. He worked in numerous architectural firms and practiced in London, Berlin, Perth, and Melbourne for 10 years before he turned to academia full-time. Was the first Oscar Niedermeyer Professor of Architecture at Birmingham City University between 2013 and 2019. And then he joined the London Met here, I'm sure very familiar to you all, as head of architecture. And then since 2023, he's been head of research at the School of Art, Architecture and Design. In 2001, he began research into the history of the foundation of Salisbury, which resulted in a beautiful book, Time, Space and Order, The Making of Medieval Salisbury. That was something, that's how I encountered your research for the first time. And having, freshly come out of medieval architecture myself. And this has then also led to further research, included funded research by the HRC, on a wonderful project on a multidisciplinary research on restaging musical performances in Coventry in the early modern period. And we'll be talking about his latest book today, so looking forward to that. And Nick Temple is Professor in Architectural History at the London Met, having previously served as the director of CUBE, which we just heard about here in the school. He's a recipient of the Rome Scholarship and the Paul Mellon Rome Fellowship, a wonderfully distinguished award, and has taught at too many universities to list individually, but it includes a stint as head of Lincoln, as well as an earlier post at the University of Pennsylvania in the States. I think you did it the right way round. You started there and came here. So, well, I shouldn't be saying that. That's not straight politics. And has published very widely. His first book is entitled Renovatio Urbis, Architecture, Urbanism and Ceremony in the Rome of Julius II, published in 2011, shortlisted for the Bruno Zevi Book Award. A beautiful book. That's how I encountered your work, Nick, for the first time in writing. Followed by Architecture and the Language Debate, Artistic and Linguistic Exchanges in Early Modern Italy, published in 2020. Followed by Disclosing Horizons, Architecture Perspective and Redemptive Space. And also the co-editor of the Routledge Reception of Classical Architecture, which I'm currently looking at for some work I'm doing. So it's a wonderful contribution. And he's currently writing another book, as Nick does. He constantly writes book to shame others in their lack of productivity. And this is something that I've heard about a little bit. And this explores aspects of environmentalism, the natural order, and it's entitled Seismic Shifts, Nature, Human Conduct, and the Built Environment. And we'll be talking about another book this evening. So I think, Christian, you are to start. Is that not Nick? Apologies. Over to you and the microphone. Thank you.
Sorry. Thanks a lot, Max. That's a lovely introduction. First of all, I just want to explain that this book that I'm going to be presenting is a co-authored book. It was a rich collaboration between myself and two Chinese academics, Ring Gao, who's actually in the audience, put your hand up, who was a collaborator in this really interesting research project. I'll explain the background briefly soon afterwards. And Jing Chao, who's a young academic I first met actually as a PhD student in his Viva examination at University of Nottingham many years ago, and has since become a very successful researcher in Shenzhen University in China. So the project, the background of the book, I'd like to introduce the book in broader contexts of how the theme kind of unfolded. Many years ago, well, quite a few years ago, 2014, Ring and myself actually attended or were invited to a conference actually at the Kunming University of Science and Technology. This was an annual event where architectural practitioners would present their work, and they'd often have keynote speakers, international architects presenting their work. And this particular occasion was my first time with this particular forum, disclosed to me an extraordinary richness of architectural practice. But the one thing that struck me as being quite significant was the sheer speed in which buildings are made in China. And it was very much in the context of the backdrop of this that the field trip was exploring the resurrection and the restoration of rural communities, basically, particularly in the Yunnan province, of which Kunming is the capital city. So this was work that Ring was actually doing as part of her own research. So we have this kind of juxtaposition between mega projects, and this is a kind of a late, very recent example, which is a mega project on the junction of the Yangtze and Jialing rivers. This is an example of an international architect involved in these mega projects that we see really developing at such a pace actually in China. So we came up with the idea of this question of time, the timing of buildings, the time it takes to build, the time which buildings are conceived. But we wanted to look at this within a deeper historical context. So that was really the kind of context, the background to writing this book. It took, as you can see, quite a long time to formulate a book proposal. Eventually we put together a book proposal, and there are a number of seminal texts which we used as the backdrop to the book. But as you can see, all the publications that deal with issues of time in building or time in the context of artistic representation very much European-based or Western-based. And these are just some examples that served as a kind of catalyst or a series of reference points to the research that we were doing. Now, the contents of the book, basically a comparison between Chinese and European perspectives on architecture and heritage in the context of this whole question of time. So the book contents contain, first of all, an introduction entitled Building in and Out of Time. This is particularly a reference to Marvin Trachtenberg's book, which I just referred to earlier, the one on the right, Building in Time. Trachtenberg also talks about the notion of building out of time, in the way in which buildings, the methods of construction have changed dramatically over the centuries. So the introduction sets the broad context of the subject, and then it starts from looking at the historical context of building and then moving into the modern age and beyond, actually into the contemporary world. And then the three main chapters, 1, 2, and 3, basically, as you can see, they're not specifically about buildings, but these are themes, topics that serve as the framework for investigating building. So we looked at this question of oral, written, and printing traditions in building. This has a very important bearing on the relation between European and Chinese perspectives, as I'll explain in a minute. This question of ritual time, the notion of transcendent and immanent concepts of ritual, again, very, very important ways of comparing the two cultures and how they also manifest themselves both in the construction of buildings, but also in the life of buildings, the occupancy of buildings. And then the third one is basically called Building Restoration and Heritage. So this is where we look at the relationship between concepts of history, understanding of history, how that informs the restoration of buildings, and how that manifests itself in the nature or the meaning of heritage. And finally, the fourth one, a series of modern case studies, and we described as reinvoking duration in building fabric, how certain kind of buildings, the design of certain buildings, try to challenge the kind of modern drive, the modern drift towards the idea of rapid construction, rapid fabrication, and even the way in which we occupy buildings over time. And one of the key influences in this fourth chapter is really the David Leathborough book, Building Time. And then we have the conclusion. So I'm just going to get some water. So that's broadly the context. Now, according to one Chinese academic who identifies a particular difference in the way in which Chinese traditions actually treated time, understood time. And I quote, "Chinese culture has a highly developed historical consciousness that is much older than in Europe. This consciousness diverged from Western models of time in three important respects." He says, first, the Chinese lack the concept of absolute time, such as that held by Newton, the idea of a kind of homogeneous understanding of time as a continuum. The Chinese also lacked a system to record the years in a linear progressive way. That's actually quite interesting. So this idea of linear time and how it's recorded chronologically, China didn't actually have that tradition. And thirdly, the Chinese seem to have shown a lack of drive to go beyond the realm governed by time and temporality, the idea of trying to distill time, to kind of control it in a way, through various avenues of science and the advancements of culture and the developments of cultural understanding. Now, one of the important things about comparing the two cultures, as we explained in the book, was this question of the calendar. And there's a very interesting quote here from Claude Lévi-Strauss, the great anthropologist. He says, "Rituals fix the stages of the calendar as localities do those of an itinerary. The latter furnish extension, the former duration." And that's a kind of interesting way of thinking about the way in which the calendar was used and informed both in China and in the European tradition. These are just a series of images that convey how calendars were represented in both traditions. Interestingly, I'll come back to this question of the calendar in kind of hopefully later discussions about, particularly about the history of rituals. one thing that was a particularly important commonality of the two traditions is this issue of sonic rhythms of time, bell ringing. This idea, this is a juxtaposition between examples in Florence, something that Christian knows a great deal about acoustic, the so-called acoustic dialogue between different bell towers in the city that mark the temporal journey of the Florentine day. This comes from a well-known book called The Noisy Renaissance. And this question of bell ringing, the location of the bell, even the timbre of the bell, became a way of understanding the time of day or the particular occasion, whether it's to do with a festival, whether it's to do with a religious tradition, whether it's to do with a judicial hearing or a particular political event. So this was a very important part of the kind of early modern, late medieval, early modern tradition of urban life through bell ringing. And then we compare that with the Chinese tradition. In China, they have a different kind of system. They have both bell towers, but also drum towers. And these were used as timekeeping methods across the different dynasties, Quan, Ming, and Qing dynasties. Clock time was only introduced in the 20th century. So we're talking about a very different tradition of bells. The drum towers are interesting because drums were used as a way of looking at the intermediate periods between the bell ringing and how drum beating actually served as a way of defining the different parts of time as it was presented in the public realm. Now, investigation examined was a comparison broadly between Confucian and Judeo-Christian concepts of time. Confucius believed in the virtue of change. This is one of the key things, going back to the reference of the Chinese academic who talked about this idea of trying to overcome time in the Western tradition. In China, a very different perspective of change was prevalent. Change was good, change was virtuous, change was something that one would adhere to and follow with great enthusiasm, as opposed to the Christian belief in an eschatological understanding of time, which broadly called end of time, final redemption, last judgment. So this idea that somehow we are searching for that culminating point in the traditions of temporality. And we could conceive this difference also in the context of cyclic and linear time, what we could describe as directionless cyclic time, the eternal return, and this idea of linear or via recta concepts of time. The Chinese, in a sense, were much more attuned to this idea of cyclic time, changes within the cycles of time, certainly in the period of Christian tradition across Europe, particularly, although it has its origins way back in the ancient world. Concepts of linear time become a very important determining factor in the way that time is measured and understood. Now, in Chapter 1, Oral, Written and Printing Traditions in Building, we examine a very interesting comparison between the two cultures. I include this little illustration here. How one builds is analogous to how one writes. In the Chinese tradition, the process of assembling component parts to form a whole. And a very close correlation, this comes from a very, very old series of characters written from an oracle from the Tang dynasty, which shows the pictographic relationship between the assembly of parts of writing versus the assembly of elements of building. So this close correlation between writing and building is something which was absolutely key to the Chinese tradition and something that is translated into the very early print traditions. Imperial China's had a long tradition of printing, long predating Europe. And we can see that in examples of published work. This was a very important, widely published Directorate of Buildings and Construction from the Song dynasty, the Yingzao Fashi, which was essentially state building standards. These were codes. And it was in a very centralized system of application of these codes. So even though you had very provincial practices of architectural, of building and architectural design, where father and son would actually communicate through these small trades and practices of craftsmanship, the overarching structure of disseminating architectural knowledge was actually through these publications, these printed texts. And these were published over many, many generations, really right up to the 20th century. And we can see the relationship between writing and architecture in a very good example. A very good example is actually the development of civil service examinations. Now, these are a very, very old practice. In imperial China, huge halls were built across China, all the different provinces of China, centrally controlled by the imperial court, and young aspiring men, in order to rise through the hierarchy of society, all had to undertake a series of very demanding examinations. And these assembly spaces, you can see the little image on the bottom right, these are small little cubicles where you were confined for days on end to actually write these examinations, to perform your best, actually in terms of very clear criteria that were actually produced. And then at the end of it, you would have the imperial examination candidates will gather in front of these massive walls where the results would be posted. So architecture itself becomes a kind of imprint of success, imprint of competition and success of this examination. So this was a tradition which went on for centuries, and one that kind of reinforces this very close connection between architecture and writing, the traditions of writing. When we compare this to the European tradition, something rather different is apparent, and I refer to this idea of the pre- and post-canonization of architectural principles or ideas. And this relates very closely to the question of the relationship between the spoken language and the formalization of language through the studia humanitatis, between basically orality and printing. In the main, most before the Renaissance, certainly before the end of the 15th, beginning of the 16th century, most builders in Europe were, if like, most were illiterate or actually had very little knowledge of Latin, which was the base language of communication during that period. And the language that they spoke, which were the dialects of different parts of Europe, those languages didn't have any rule books. There was no structure to what we call the Vulgate. Language was the local vernaculars were language which evolved through time. And those languages were appropriated, sometimes reinvented in very particular ways, albeit they were written down. Dante was, of course, a great writer of the Italian, of the Florentine vernacular. So this question of how communication of building works was undertaken, we see this as an example of tracing floors in York Minster. Well, one can imagine the communication between masons would have been very much based on the oral practices, oral traditions of communication, and of course drawing. Now, a very interesting argument has been presented by Georgia Clark, who's an academic now retired, at the Courtaulds, in research that she did on Italian architecture, where she basically argues that spoken languages actually had a very close correlation to local architectural practices. Now, putting in marks, in brackets, vernacular in the broader sense of what we mean by vernacular. Before the canonization of architecture through printing, of course, the printing press was invented in 1440 in Mainz in Germany, Mainz in Germany, and then was disseminated through printing presses across Europe. In Italy, of course, it was in Spain, in Venice, and then in Florence, Rome, and Fivizzano, and other places. We see this correlation that Clark argues between the traditions, the local traditions of building practices, and how they were translated into, or how they correlated with the local vernaculars that existed at the time, or the dialects that existed. And these are just a kind of an example of how that would have been understood. When we see this in the context of the 15th century, particularly, something decisive happens. This is the point at which the printing press is established around the time of the early to mid 15th century, before we see printing presses widely developed across Europe. But we see actually how the interrelationships between orality through the vulgar language, the vernacular languages, and architectural representation was very, very important. An interesting example is Brunelleschi. Brunelleschi, we see him as the great architect, but he was also a famous street poet. And much of his work was actually communicated through his ability to vocalize his ideas on the street. He was a major poet who didn't write his poetry, but actually delivered his poetry as part of this kind of street life of Florence in early 15th century. Just giving an illustration of the famous perspective experiment, which he actually did outside the Duomo facing the baptistry, which was probably almost certainly a piece of performance, a piece of demonstration, not a kind of silent sort of scientific experiment. So this issue of orality was very much part of that tradition. But when we get to printing in Europe compared to China, remember China goes back to the ancient world, printing had a huge impact on the dissemination of architectural ideas, which then emerged into forms of canonization, or the canons of architecture. And these are just the early examples of the 1499 famous Hypneratmachia Polyphali, not about architecture, albeit it's been attributed to Leon Battista Alberti, one theory, the great Renaissance architect. But this work actually was a very inventive way of using text to shape particular forms which were part of the kind of communicative dimensions of the descriptions that were conveyed in the text, and the idea of how the inscriptions, the wood prints, served as a kind of sequence of events, almost like a kind of series of film clips as described in this journey. It's a journey of a romance, basically, of this mystical figure called Polyphilo. And then when we get to this is in the late 15th century, when we get to the beginning of the 17th century, we get something entirely different. We get widely used treatises. These treatises are published, translated, and also copied in various different ways. In chapter 2, Ritual, Time, Transcendence, Immanence, I'll go very quickly through. The ancient rites in China identified very distinct structures of rites, and these were very clearly mapped out. So there was a kind of order and sequence of these rites, which again didn't exist in Europe. And these are auspicious, inauspicious, celebratory, hosting, and military rites, all of which have a bearing on architecture, but also how they have a particular relationship to architectural ideas. I won't go into the details of foundation practices and the correlations that exist between European and ancient Chinese practices, as an example here, the founding of cities, which of course Joseph Rickwood wrote about in both the European and Chinese traditions in his famous book, Idea of a Town. But also when we look at the issue of Christian liturgical practices, sacraments of baptism, confirmation, Eucharist, and how they compared or very different from the Confucian idea of the Book of Rites, which were both broadly religious and secular. There was no differentiation between the two in the way they were ordered. Oh, I'll list that one. Particularly interesting in the comparison between the two traditions, and when we look at consecration and inauguration renewal ceremonies. The book actually looks at an interesting comparison between a very important inauguration ceremony of the Temple of Heaven in Beijing, the Ming Dynasty, and the other one we looked at was actually the inauguration of Florence Cathedral during the period of Eugenius IV, and how the idea of these inauguration ceremonies, these foundation ceremonies, actually entailed lots of other rituals, secondary rituals, which were brought into play in this one unifying system of foundation of buildings. And then finally, what's most interesting is we look at the Chinese tradition, the building act itself is a form of ritual. This is a 15th century carpenter's builder's manual, Lu Ban Jing, which was actually again republished, reprinted many times. Building as a series of enactments, ritual reenactments. Eliades quote, each house that is built in a certain sense or is a reenactment of the creation of the world applies very clearly to the Chinese practice in all its different forms. And this is, in a way, it doesn't really refer to any particular building. The most modest house was also undertaken as a ritual act. And finally, the chapter 3, Building Restoration Heritage, the vagaries of historical dating in Europe were very different from the rigorously recorded dynastic dating in Imperial China. Looking at, for example, Florence Baptistry, the belief that Florence Baptistry was basically built under the period of Constantine on the site of a temple to Mars, and even actually the belief that it was contemporaneous with the Pantheon in Rome. That was one kind of theory that came out of the Middle Ages and even continued actually into the Renaissance. And then we have this other interesting tradition in Europe we call heritage as anachronism, where we have this idea of belonging or appropriate to a period other than that being portrayed. We see, for example, the idea of the Holy Sepulchre, buildings that take on the identity of this paradigmatic building in Jerusalem. So this idea of double identity was a curious feature of the concept of time and temporality and heritage at that time. This is very different from the Chinese tradition in heritage terms, where neither place nor building nor material actually define the authenticity of architecture. The Chinese past is both spiritually active but physically invisible, as Pierre Rickman actually described. And this is a very interesting quote. I won't go through it in detail, but basically Simone de Beauvoir basically questions whether we can even call the Forbidden City in Beijing as a historical monument, because none of the original material exists there anymore. And that the Chinese, obviously, after each dynasty, would move the capital. And they would sometimes destroy buildings and then relocate those buildings with new materials. So this idea of what place is in terms of heritage and historical continuity, and even its material authenticity, was a very different world in the Chinese context. I referred here to the interesting paradox of the ship of Theseus, which actually I use that as a reference to think about this question of authenticity. And finally, we have a series of contemporary case studies, the final chapter. I'm not going to go through the details of these buildings, but it's a comparison between European and Chinese buildings, different locations. We chose these very specifically in reference to understanding how they respond to different temporalities, whether it's because of the historic context, it's the way in which the buildings were constructed, or their ceremonial use and importance within the contemporary world. This one is a particularly interesting one, Water Street in Salt City in China, to building a complex of buildings which Ring and I actually visited and recorded. This huge complex, basically a shopping mall in the traditional Chinese tradition, was actually built in 6 months, including huge canals. It was a vast construction. And when it was built, when you go there and you're a consumer, you're also involved in rituals. So these ritual reenactments were part parcel of the consumer's world. Very different kind of understanding. So this idea of nostalgia, looking back to the past. So the idea of time somehow slowing down to the kind of ritual events that happen within the life of traditional imperial China, reenacted. For the European examples, we included St. Martin in the Fields, London, a project by Eric Perry Architects in collaboration with a number of artists. This is a really interesting project, and it enabled us to look at the temporalities of the street. And of course, because it was the alterations of the restoration or alterations of the project, involved changes to the crypt, which now, of course, is a great cafe and exhibition space and a chapel, and how this idea of temporality of the street actually is appropriated to different kinds of modes of temporality lower down in the substrata of the building itself. And this is a way of rethinking the idea of urban life. At least that's the interpretation. And also we looked at the geometries used in the particular methods of, or insertions actually into the building fabric, including the lovely east window. And then a really interesting project that we looked at was the Bordeaux Concert Hall, the Stormont Concert Hall by DRDH Architects, an extraordinary piece of architecture in a really interesting context, which talks about this idea of time through changing seasons, and how the architects, quite interestingly, respond in very subtle ways to the way in which occupancy of civic life, the nature of civic life between library and concert hall, is a direct response to the changing seasons in Bordeaux. Bordeaux is in the Arctic Circle, so it's very, very the daytime periods are very short, and the way in which the building modulates in response to that practice is an interesting example. And finally, there are lots of other examples which I'm not including. This is another one, Pied d'Avoine, San Salvatore in Umbria. This is a really interesting project, which was an old church converted into a house where time and modes of occupants, basically a holiday home, but the way in which it was appropriated, responding to the seasons and the time of occupancy and the adaptation of the building in really subtle ways, was a really good example of how we can rethink the concept of time in the frenetic world of the technocratic world today. And that's it. I've just put this in as one little reference point, just as a prompt for Christian. Festive time versus video time. This is a little encounter I had on a particular festival in Florence, which we could talk about later. That's it. I'm sorry.
Really interesting talk, interesting book as well. So very pleased to be on the same platform. So I'm going to do it a slightly different way. I'm not going to go through the book. I'm going to talk a little bit more about why I wrote it and talk about why it's important, I think, to think about the opportunities that thinking about architecture as festival might give us. And in a sense, why the unique way in which I think I approached the relationship between festival and architecture as a way of critiquing architecture. So this is going to go in the background while I do it, because I'm really interested in the way there's no boundaries, no borders. People just interact, interfere, and at the same time, the rhythms of the people in the processions are talking about a ritual, rhythmic association. They walk differently, they behave differently. So perhaps the most controversial aspect of the book is the title, which uses the contentious term continuity. The use of the term culture is difficult enough within the architectural press, academic and practical, focus as much of it is on aspects of identity, aesthetics, power and technology. But even nearing the end of the project, it was clear to the editors at Bloomsbury that the use of the combined terms cultural continuity, which I had been using since the beginning of the project, should remain in the title. They were insistent. The issue with these terms arises because, unlike issues relating to form and aesthetics, which often form part of others' work on culture, when understood holistically, they imply that architecture has meaning, and that this meaning is communicable across centuries of change, progress, and difference, which in turn, apparently problematically, gives an inherent value to the things we inherited, whether we like it or not. In this sense, I'd like to use the word inheritance rather than heritage, as inheritance at least implies an engagement in tradition rather than a process involving autonomous objects and facts. To many, the quest for finding meaning in such inheritance in architecture is a form of nostalgia, based upon misconception. So this is the path that you're just looking at the moment. This is the contemporary progression. The quest of finding meaning, such inheritance in architecture is a form of nostalgia based upon the misconception that consensus is possible in the modern world. And it is also suspect because even if such possibility were articulated, the results would be predicated upon power dynamics and implicit prejudice, rendering the exercise marginal and therefore of little value. For these critics, the idea that any form of singularity of purpose in the modern world between different people and different cultures is, at best, fiction. But is this true? Does such a belief in the atomized nature of the modern world account for 100% of every experience? What if the cultural phenomenon that forms the basis of the quest to find some form of cultural continuity is in itself multifaceted? What if there was something familiar to all cultures that in its enactment accommodates difference, something like a traditional civic festival, where many narratives compete and challenge for attention and control while occurring concurrently? Something like a traditional festival where various activities combine to make a whole, where different actors take control at different times, under different circumstances, while the festival still maintains a singular purpose and identity. What if the temporal oscillations of such event, where the conventional power structures shift, reverse, and then reform, also engage with architecture, which is in itself transformed in the process? As you see, this is the banner, the palio that's won at the Calcio Storico, the big football match, and you'll notice a man ceremonially carrying a couple of footballs in there, next to this restaurants in the background and this shop in the foreground. It's all mixed. There's no hierarchy in the sense that we understand it, but it's all valid. People just cross. There's no one stopping. It's a really interesting process. So many narratives compete and challenge for attention and control while occurring concurrently. Something like a traditional festival where forms of activities combine to make a whole, and architecture which is transformed in the process. What would happen if we used such experiences as a benchmark for understanding the nature of architecture itself? What if the experience of such events and the architecture that accommodates it are the primary measure of its value, not other forms of abstract knowledge? And what if recognition of the authenticity of such experiences became the real measure of its value? And by authentic here, I think the point is that the authentic is not knowledge of it, it's the experience of it, it's the willingness to participate in the activity itself on all of the different levels that you're witnessing here. Could we use such an understanding of festival as the basis for the evaluation of architecture? That is in essence what I try to achieve in the book. Setting out on this quest, it was not my intention to discover the origins of culture, of such culture. That is for philosophers and theologians to debate. My interest was seeing if, in festivals, I could identify the value placed upon architecture like the value placed upon the activities that are incorporated in it. And I felt that church processions and civic parades that had their origins in the medieval period were the best place to start, because they were understood at the time as an opportunity to reveal a broad spectrum of spatial and temporal experience that linked the real places with their tropological, allegorical, and anagogical partners, as well as the time of origins with lived time and the end of time with eternity, within which everything is enfolded. This link to different modes of temporality is key, because much of this spectrum of time is still present in the experience in the 20th century festivals. And by concentrating on festivals, it allowed me to ask the reader to compare the two without having to delve at length into a treatise on the philosophical nature of architecture and time. I'm just asking, can architecture be understood as a species of festival? It was clear when they began that when they began the festivals, they were not confined to street activity, but were seen as a critical part of all the manifestation of all culture. This is the path of the same procession in the 15th century. 14th century. From architecture to painting and much in between. And in places such as Florence, such depth of experience is still active even in our contemporary world. That the Middle Ages is a suitable candidate to begin such an exploration is confirmed by Jacques Le Goff, writing in the 1970s, who explained the continuity of place and time and representation by saying, quote, "The Middle Ages not only confused heaven and earth, or rather treated them as a spatial continuity, but they treated time as merely a moment of eternity. There was thus a temporal continuity analogous with that of space. time belonged to God and could only be lived out, unquote. And because of these ambiguities, he argued, again quote, the vital impulses characteristic of the Middle Ages culminated in the medieval festival. So he's saying that the urban identity of Florence is best manifested through festival. Not just any way, that's the best way they could manifest it. The continuity of these liturgical and perhaps even sacramental traditions within European culture was developed during the Renaissance by the emerging civic culture of the period, which is what we're looking at here. This is civic culture, where new and modified buildings and spaces of the medieval city were adapted alongside various ceremonial traditions from this apparently darker medieval past. The Renaissance guys hated the medieval. They thought it was, they were a bunch of idiots. Processions, parades, festivals and performances, some of which had survived the ravages of barbarian occupation and could trace their origins back to the classical part authentically, came to the reinvigorated cityscapes and began to help craft the emerging civic culture, albeit now within a Christian milieu. Such urban festivals and their architecture, therefore, offer an opportunity to recover and imagine the civic experiences of the Middle Ages, which, although often masked by political, social, and religious conflict, fashioned opportunities for the medieval burghers to discover communities and identities beyond normal, mundane temporal boundaries, and revealed the time out of time experiences that characterize such acts of civic belonging in festival with the ontological experiences. As well as these ontological aspects of the festival, which account for its continuity, in the Dark Ages it is clear that also power imbalances, oppression, racism, persecution, bigotry, these all happened. However, there was also faith and hope. Therefore, I argue that even if these terms of power and identity constitute the majority of the landscape of history and stop us from believing that there is any possibility of consensus, they do not count for everything. Even if there is only 1% left to discuss in relation to community, humanity and hope, then this book is about that 1%. So architecture and cultural continuity seeks to offer new insights into ways architecture through history has adapted to and modified its setting, whilst also reinforced aspects of cultural continuity. This aim, set out in the introduction of the book, also has benefits to the way we build now, because, this is a quote from the book, if we begin this task by removing the ideas of modernity from their position of domination and reclaim the experience of architecture as a manifestation of broader ritual realities, including a better understanding of the natural order, then we are also one step closer for potentially improved multicultural understanding, because it is our humanity and not our politics that binds us to greater truths. To develop the argument from festival to architecture, the work is divided into three parts. The first part analyses the contemporary festival of San Giovanni in Florence, which you've seen a part of there, tracing its history from Roman origins via the medieval period to the end of the Renaissance through to today. This study is used to introduce themes related to persistence, resistance, i.e. it has a life, you can't just make it do what you want it to do. So it has a resistance to people using it, and a continuity of tradition and how these shape and are shaped by architecture, art, and the ritual landscape of the city. Part 2 builds on this foundation by gathering theoretical tools from architecture, literature, philosophy, and anthropology, which combine to offer a framework for the appraisal of architecture as an experience rather than as purely as a form. The final part tries to apply these arguments to 4 separate case studies, which place buildings from historical context alongside more contemporary works according to a variety of different thematic emphases. This first one, the rule of movement, uses the Elizabethan Hardwick Hall and Le Corbusier's Pavilion Suisse to look at the way choreographed movement can be seen as a way of embedding cultural meaning and narratives into a building. The next chapter, Ornament and Theatricality, contrasts the decorative program of the Rockefeller Center in New York with the ornamental schema and its fracture in the Assam Brothers Weltenburg Abbey. The third chapter, Ornamentalism and Heritage, uses Edward Said's ideas on Western Orientalism to compare Lord Leighton's house and studio in London with Beit Beirut, a 20th century house recently converted into a museum in Beirut. And finally, Politics and Landscape, which compares two spaces designed for governance, Salisbury's medieval charter house in England and the Australian Parliament building in Canberra. Alongside the obvious point that the particular way the buildings are described and contextualized in the book is in itself a theoretical position, the book has two main arguments. First, that meaning in architecture is carried through history by the continuity of cultural traditions that are always in a state of flux. And second, that the value of good architecture can be best appraised through experiences seen in relation to community and belonging, as well as ritual, art and place, rather than in terms of politics and form. Both these arguments are introduced in part one alongside concepts of origin and repetition of time, temporality and experience. Within this analytical matrix, the book develops Victor Turner's concept of separation, transition and incorporation, originally conceived to describe the various levels of engagement in ritual practice that you've witnessed with the photographers jumping in and out of the performers who are incorporated into the procession, and applies them to buildings and landscape in order to show that, like festival, cultural significance of architecture can be compared across centuries and, quote, worldly difference can be subordinated to the recognition of ontological community. And, spoiler alert, it is the experiential landscape, it is the idea of transition of these three, transition above all that offers the clearest argument for adopting such a scheme. From the language used thus far, it should be clear that the primary methodological approach used in the book is phenomenological and hermeneutical, and as such is informed by personal observations, sketches, maps, drawings, as well as archival research and readings from several disciplines. Consequently, alongside the interpretive anthropology of Victor Turner, leading to Tim Ingold, the works of Dalibor Vesely, Hans-Georg Gadamer, Verglin, Ricoeur, and Martin Heidegger, and their interpretations of Plato, are used at various points to clarify and support the overall argument. More specific themes relating to medieval and early Renaissance history are indebted to the works of Jacques Le Goff, Karl Lewith, and Ferdinand Schevel, who came from the historiographic school of Freiburg, who, in relation to the possible evidence that can be used to evaluate history, argues that the position of enlightened generations, that's us, that legend is fiction, history is truth, as by drawing too absolute a line between the two of them. For example, in chapter 10, Orientalism and Heritage, Leighton House and Beit Beirut offers a comparison between Lord Leighton's studio and a house in Kensington from the 1860s and Yusuf Haidar's recently completed Beit Beirut Museum in Lebanon, in relation to Edward Said's polemical study of Orientalism from the 70s. Unlike some of the other chapters in this section, this chapter inverts the values attached to tradition and modernity, finding favour in the newer building. In essence, the chapter argues that although Leighton's house feigns a form of traditionality, it actually embodies all the acquisitive attitudes of colonialist behaviour and its content to assemble authentic, in inverted commas, purchases according to an ideal of Islamic beauty, ultimately indebted to romantic historicist aesthetics. Whereas the newer building, Peter Karl observes, that, quote, by contrast, Frost documents the vicissitudes of cultural adaptations of an actual house in Beirut, Beit Beirut, formerly the Barakat House, built in 1924, found itself by one of the Green Line crossings and therefore became a site during the Lebanese Civil War for Phalangist snipers, who fortified some of the walls to make bunkers, which is what you can see at the back here of one of the living rooms. fortified walls to make bunkers, which with shot holes to patrol the crossing. After a period of dereliction, interruptions due to successive outbreaks of violence and disputes over exhibitions and programs, it was reclaimed as a museum for Beirut and the Civil War, preserving the ground and first floors in their battered state. Because of its unusual configuration, so this is still Peter's quote, because of its unusual configuration, in fact, two typical Beirut houses sharing the central courtyard, addressing the street corner with the two-storey arcade on a rusticated base, it is both house and town, and therefore an evocative place for fragmented memories to dwell, illustrative of the architecture that is held in common as conditions for history. It will never be beautiful in Leighton's sense of the term. Rather, a beauty resides in the commitment to finding a common memory of that which has too often been violent and discord. Hopefully the book will find a wide readership, challenge some prejudices and spark some debate, both in relation to the study of architectural history and the way we understand and develop architecture today. Thank you.
Very much for a wonderful presentation. Three different approaches to presenting a book, which I think was really complementary, as is the content. Our audience has been patiently and listening and with great focus. So perhaps, I have a couple of questions that I'd like to ask, but maybe we can first see if we have questions from the audience. You may need some time to gather your thoughts. There's a lot of material, but yeah, please. Let me and back to the.
Thank you. I couldn't resist.
It is, yeah.
As an author on a book called Time for Architecture, quick blur, in case anyone wants to read about time. An awful lot I can say, but I'm just going to concentrate on one thing that I think straddles both. Is the problem, what I loosely call is the Western or Christian concept of time. I'm familiar with the Chinese introduction of time, a lot to do with railways, actually. But another interesting one is the Inuit, who had very little concept of time the way that we do until Christianity was introduced. And they were watching clocks because they had to keep it tally on the seasons and on the time in order to enact Christian ceremonies. So that was the thing that it confused them to start off with when they got clocks and didn't know what to do with them. So this idea, the Christian concept of time, which is a Western concept of time, which we export to other places. But I don't want to dwell on one particular aspect of it, which actually, I think goes back to more of what you're saying, is the medieval concept of time, which is different from antiquity, which was, first of all, that time was going to come to an end very shortly, because you were in the last kingdom, and the next kingdom was going to reign with the Antichrist. So actually, what you were doing was waiting for the end of time, and also you were concertinaing time behind you. So the Christian ritual is actually to reenact something that happened in the time of Christ. That's what Mass is about. You're actually reenacting something, and therefore concertinaing time. And my view is you can really only understand Gothic architecture unless if you understand that, is they didn't have our concept of time. And ritual and movement, in other words, pilgrimage was movement, and actually undertaking an action of pilgrimage could be done in different places. So the idea was that, as you say about ceremony, is that these ceremonies actually were a means of reenacting something. It could be the movement from Christ to the crucifixion, etc., etc. And also their interest in one particular time, which is Constantinian time. And so they had no real sense of anachronism in the sense that we do.
I think a lot of what you say is factually true. I think the one point at which I would begin to question is the points at which we look back at the medieval period. And one of the things I spent a long time doing when I was writing the book on Salisbury was trying to get into the mindset. And Jack Le Goff, I think, is one of the best writers at doing this. And the sense of the idea that time, people were there waiting, you know, with trepidation for the end of the world, is partially true, but also, I don't think, also was true for every situation. The relationship was, I think, as much, I mean, for a start, it's Neoplatonic. A lot of the relationship in time is Neoplatonic. They had the Timaeus. And so, for me, the argument about time and movement in the medieval period relates back to the very last section of Timaeus, when he talks about the solids that are made, that are, time begins when the solids are put into movement. And the idea that processions around the church is, in a sense, inside the Platonic solid. So the timing, the time of renewal, which is also the time of origins, because it's all enwrapped in eternity. That was, again, an important aspect of it. There is a simultaneity as well in medieval time. It's not just teleological. It has lots of different layers. And I think the danger is that when we look at the medieval period, we oversimplify these things into categories. How can you have a time? How can you be this apparently ignorant medieval guy who's completely waiting for the end of the world? He's thinking about origins. He's moving around a building in a way that's both crossing boundaries, which is breaking aspects of law and reinforcing aspects of law. There's a whole series of layers, and I think that complexity is more important than in a sense, the way we tend to try to dilute or dissect, the way we try to dissect it.
I agree with that. I wasn't suggesting that everyone was quitting in their boots for a millennium. I'm just saying that, in fact, the sequence of time, eventually, a time was to come when time stopped. Equally, but I agree completely about the complexity of it, in as much as the spiritual world had as much meaning as the physical world.
Yeah.
It was extremely complex, and the relationship with the past was also very complex. Obviously, people understood the past, but you could actually concertina the past at the same time as understanding. No, I agree. The complexity. I just picked on that particular thing.
There is an interesting point of reference to think about this, because talking about this question of Christian concept of time, if we look at St. Augustine's Confessions, St. Augustine actually provided a really enlightening perspective of time when he talked about, it was a scenario, supposing all the stars went out, but actually the potter's wheel still turns. And he said, in a sense, this is the driver of time, it's the definition of time. He talks about the fact that time is not measured by the heavens, by heavenly movements, but it's something that's internalized in us. That's in essence what he's saying. And what is interesting when you look at ritual is that we can think of an analogous relation between ritual and the potter's wheel. The rhythm of the wheel becomes a way of thinking about ritual that is not necessarily completely in tune with the heavens, but somehow acquires its own momentum and its own life, which I think is kind of an interesting way of thinking about this question of time. There is a kind of a strong argument that rituals actually are not determined by calendars, but actually the calendar is determined by the ritual. So the rituals actually become the framework around which we construct or we think about calendar time. We think of calendar time as something inflexible and fixed, but of course it wasn't like that in the Middle Ages. It was very proximate. Of course, there was always a desire to make calendars in terms of responding to celestial movements more accurate. We know the Gregorian, the Julian versus the Gregorian calendar. But I think we underestimate the importance of the groundedness of time in terms of ritual, performance, and reenactment. I think the St. Augustine's reference to the potter's wheel, I think, is a really interesting way of thinking about that connection.
There's also Orosius, which I think was one of the most published books. He was a pupil, and his status was because he was a pupil of St. Augustine, and that was the book that set out the time framework which we're talking about.
It's interesting. There's also a spatial aspect to that, because the work I've recently been in the music on Coventry, seems to argue that the political rules of the city were set up after the Corpus Christi procession, and therefore the Corpus Christi procession actually had an impact on the political boundaries, not the other way around. That the rich, and what this suggests is, particularly when you come into medieval cities, which is where this really begins, when you begin to get civic culture, that's really the point at which we're talking about with rituals, that the spatial and temporal aspects of it have to be acted out. And that's, in a sense, what I'm trying to argue is a way of also, can we understand architecture in a similar way, spatially as well as temporal.
Thank you. Are there other questions from the audience? Yes. Maybe the recording will want you to. Sorry.
Oh.
Maybe instructed to.
It's for Nick, and it's about the Forbidden City.
Yeah.
And the relationship of time and space and being away from the everyday world. So the further north you go in the Forbidden City, the further you go away from all the everyday markets and selling and into a very refined world where you're not ignorant of temporality because you're very subject to the seasons. But can you just comment on the sort of refinement of moving through that space? And does temporality on the sort of everyday, you're going away from the everyday world. Can you just comment on that?
In China or a particular context?
In China, in the Forbidden
Yeah.
City.
I think Ring might have more knowledge of that than me.
I just want to ask a little bit more in your question when you said move to the north and it's away from daily life. So when you said north, what do you refer to?
Well, Nick showed a big plan of the Forbidden City.
Yeah.
And from what I understand, you come in at the south, and the more important you are, the further north you can go. And the very far north is for just the
Within the Forbidden City.
within the Forbidden City. So it's like a city within a city within a city that's quite removed from the everyday world.
That's where the garden is, where the people living. So the Forbidden City is for both kind of emperor's daily activity, his work. But then when he needs to go back to his living courtyard, that's on the north. And the one thing we actually discussed this on the south side, they have a lot of philosophy that you need to take care of your people, you need to do different things, achieve what you need to be achieved as emperor. But on the north, for the courtyard where queen or empress wife managed the whole courtyard, her philosophy is no action, don't do anything, just merge into the nature. So that's the main plaque on her palace, no action. So that's how it's different.
Merging with nature.
Yeah.
Maybe as people are thinking of further questions, may I ask one about method, I guess? The sense that both your books are unusual in some respects, both for the scope and ambition, but also for the fact that you engage very rigorously with history and historical material and primary sources and scholarship around that, and the great works of their edition. And at the same time, you have these contemporary case studies also, and they're very significant. I'm just curious, is it, if you want to capture the experience of time through architecture or in architecture, is it that method, was required, or just curious about, if you could reflect a little bit on that shared method and what it's given you, or why it's necessary.
I mean, for us, because the starting point of the investigation was looking at contemporary Chinese architecture, and it seemed appropriate that the case studies were a challenge because, which buildings do you choose? So it's kind of, it's a kind of infinite possibility in terms of the kind of choice of buildings. It was really through a lot of discussion between the three of us about particular buildings. Some of the buildings we'd seen, the physical buildings, that I'd seen or Ring had seen, and then Ching actually suggested a location, building, and context presented very different kind of issues about this question of temporality and time. The reason it seemed appropriate, because it's a kind of historical sweep looking at these three key themes: the theme of basically broadly language, the theme of ritual, the theme of heritage or inheritance, as you described, which is absolutely key to it, is where I think it was most apparent that there were clear differences in the way that cultural traditions were actually followed, where architecture lies embedded within those three lenses, those three ways of interpreting time. So architecture is something that you see through the act of speaking, through the act of rituals, ritual reenactments, or through the act of restoring, reconstructing, relocating buildings in the tradition of China's voices. So the modern examples, in a way, were quite specific, quite modest in comparison to some of the kind of Chinese examples that we're looking at. But they seem to me to be a way, the thing that we're interested in is to what extent contemporary buildings could challenge certain kind of assumptions about time in the way that our observance of time, our understanding of time. David Leatherbar, of course, describes beautifully that buildings are not in time, but time is in buildings. And it's that kind of idea that time embeds itself, and actually time is in us, in our mortality, and how we inhabit those spaces, and our own immortality measured against kind of the mortality or the history, the modes of occupancy of buildings over time. And that idea, that relationship, was one of the criteria for actually how we could look at these particular case studies. I mean, the ones that I thought, the one I thought was particularly interesting in the Chinese context was actually Border Street, the one in Salt City. In one sense, it was utterly bizarre. You know, this walking around what looked like kind of historic Chinese market with these beautiful canals and bridges and temples, all built within a period of, I think it was 6 months. Extraordinary. And we actually spoke to the architect who actually built, and the time frame of building this thing was just absolutely mind-boggling. This was actually a tradition that was being practiced in other cities. So there was a kind of sense of nostalgia for shopping. Consumerism is not something you simply go to an arcade or shopping mall, but you participate in rituals. So the ritual is a kind of a way of recollecting your heritage or your inheritance within the process of the consumerist culture, which was obviously very strong in China. And it has a deep history going back to previous times in the early modern period. So that example I thought was really interesting because alongside shopping, people were actually participating in these ritual events, people getting dressed up as if they're monks, or parading on gondolas or the equivalent of barges on the canals. So this idea, this was actually part of the everyday life, the cycles, the rhythms of this particular setting. Salt City is an interesting case in point. It's an ancient city where salt was extracted. It had a history of rich architecture, most of which is gone. There's only one small example left in the centre of the city. So as if this project was trying to re-establish a certain link, which had been totally erased over time by mass housing projects, and the city's expanded. It's now 3 million or something in terms of population. So this idea of connection between history, how you can relive it, reenact it within the everyday life, the everyday rhythms of consumerism was one example I thought was particularly interesting.
I enjoyed that one in the book. And it's sort of, in the end, as you're talking about it, I'm thinking it's a bit like Las Vegas. There's this sort of slightly strange, because it works in the same way that the guys walking around in strange costumes, which are taken from Renaissance paintings, work in the festival for strange reasons, which are, in a sense, something that I think is a part of it. I think from my point of view, I think history is a little bit like a dance around a topic. And when you're looking at something, one of the things I'm always intrigued about is trying to understand what happened. What was the brief? How did it happen? What were the what were the reasons behind it? What were the options that were available? How did it, and that in order to be able to answer those questions, you have to do quite a lot of broad reading to understand the mentalities and the culture of things. And one of the best ways I think I try to describe it to me is a bit like a lot of history sometimes feels like it's dissecting a leg on a table, and that they get really good at describing the anatomy of the leg. You can describe what the tendon does, what the muscle. But you've only got one leg, and you've never seen walking. So how do you get from this really great understanding of the leg to the idea of walking? It's a really difficult thing to conceptualize, but actually that's what we're, in a sense, trying to do as a historian, is to try to bring from fragmentary evidence, and this is why that quote from Shegel is important, this historiographic school from Freiburg, is this notion that myth and fact are too separated in the way that we are taught often to understand history. So for my own history, for my own understanding of history, I have to work triple hard to make sure I'm not making any mistakes on the dissection table, but actually I'm talking about walking. And it's a really difficult place to be, but it brings me back to this Augustinian thing, which is the Harry Potter's will, that the idea that there is no present has no duration, and the only way that you can ultimately describe time is the present of past things and the present of future things, and lived time is the point at which those two meet. Contuitus, I think is this Latin term he uses. And so that's where we are. And in order to try to understand it, we have to bring the contemporary stuff in, because ultimately that's a part of our culture. We carry that. And so looking at this, it's about trying to understand how these different aspects come together. And I think for me, with the case studies, which is why I like the water one, is that the moment when you get a sense of that depth, when that depth comes alive in the description, you're beginning to get close to what constitutes something that has real value. And when you come to a building that doesn't have that, you sort of know it. And that's really, for me, the interesting part. Even when you have things like the water street, where you don't know why it has value, but it sort of does. And that makes you question those things. So I think the historian of bringing it up to the present is because that's what we have to try to do. Because in a sense we're doing it that way, and we have to reflect back at the same time. This is one way in which you can do that.
Thank you. Very interesting answers. Other questions? Maybe I'll mention one more specific for you, Nick. I was really struck by the slide of, this is the Chinese understanding of time, this is the Western understanding of time, this is lacking in China, this is lacking in, this is where we don't have the absolute time or chronological time, we have this very rich sense of cyclical time. But now we inhabit the same capitalist world. I think the Chinese Communist Party itself speaks of capitalism with Chinese characteristics as a term, it's a formal term. And there's a sense that the West is sort of completely at sea and disintegrating, and the only power that has purpose and clear direction is China. So I'm just curious, in China itself, but given also the pace of the development that you're speaking about, to what extent do we still inhabit these two different temporalities? I mean, clearly there's legacies, inheritances, and so on, but I mean, do you still sense that? Is that the argument part of the book that can persevere, or do we actually have to, have the roles sort of curiously, not reversed, but I mean, how have they mingled?
Yes, I mean, my sense when my visits to China, and this is something that with Ring's kind of involvement in this book, the remarkable way in which Chinese can have understanding of time in different ways, the idea that one can coexist within this world of rapid change, but at the same time that you can be part of this world, be part of the ritual world, these kind of moments, these moments of, which is really important to the Chinese, in Beijing, the kind of rituals of the myths and folklore which they were brought up to understand and actually follow and adhere to. The idea of costume is a really important component of that. The thing that recently I've read actually a book which kind of provides an interesting context to this, which is Giorgio Agamben's book called Infancy and History, The Destruction of Experience. And it's something I was referring on to in reference to your interpretation of experience. Because he talks about experience, which I think is particularly interesting in the context of China. He talks about experience through language. That he doesn't understand language as speaking. He says that we are language animals, basically. So that, Heidegger's concept, a belief that language is something which is a kind of non-reflective involvement. So you don't reflect in the language, in a language species. We are involved in that. So he talks about this notion of understanding of language as a way of understanding, re-understanding, or re-interpreting the relation between nature and culture. In the West, we have this assumption, and it's long been upheld, that these two things are opposites, or at least they're in a conflict. In China, I don't believe that, because actually, and Agamben's kind of thesis about the relationship between the experience of the festival, for example, where the festival actually sits somewhere between infancy and history. And when he talks about infancy, he's talking about play. He's talking about this idea of something which is primordial, actually in our experience of the street, in our experience of ritual events, almost before it becomes cultural. And somewhere it's always on the cusp of this shift between one and the other. So he talks about language animal, language that becomes speaking when we communicate, but you don't need to communicate in a ritual. It's something much more primitive, much more primordial in many respects. So in a way, when I was looking at the Chinese practice of ritual, that's exactly what I'm getting. That's my sense as an outsider, as a kind of a non-Chinese person visiting this environment, this totally different kind of environment. So I think that's a kind of interesting way of thinking about it. It kind of challenges our preconceptions of the cultural continuity versus our understanding of the natural order.
Yeah. Did you want to add anything to that at all?
Well, I can say a little bit the experience of writing this book with Nick that I'm totally from Chinese. I've grown up in China, so I understand in a lot of Chinese way. And while I'm writing this, the most amazing thing is to see how Nick's interpretation, your analyze of the same thing, kind of sometimes totally different, and then going to different layers, very wide range of understanding. Well, for me, through writing this book, I'm actually transformed in a way myself, knowing those things. So I'm just thinking it's very going to individual person as well when we're talking about all the themes of heritage and time, because we have two cases in China that for Forbidden City, well, Nick thinking, the materials being changed, etc., and people still thinking that's a heritage. There's no way it's not a heritage. And then in Water Street, when it's totally newly built, we had actually a survey by a PhD students of the people visiting there and look at that. More than half thinking it is heritage. Doesn't matter whether the material or technology. So it's all going to their individual kind of understanding that the heritage actually staying with people themselves. And then in the process, we are writing. I think when we're writing about ritual, for example, the feel is time is slowing down because we are thinking of that way rather than thinking of current in the context with advanced technology, etc. That's my adding to that.
In terms of multiculturalism, there's another issue. Because if modernity only offers one answer to a problem, this sort of rational structure to something, you can't have multiple things going on at the same time. There's only one right way to do something. And therefore the idea that you can have different people doing things in different ways becomes much more difficult within a modernist culture than it does in history. So you can read about, for example, 28, 29-year-old men in Florence in the Renaissance who their mothers were worried they weren't getting married because they still had too close a relationship with their buddies. That may have been sexual, may not have been sexual, maybe no one cared. But it was not a problem. They were just worried that they were getting married. Whereas the obsession with sexuality now would mean that you would have to define that in a particular way. And the ways in which people define things has to have a right or a wrong, rather than allowing things to happen in various different ways. So I think there's a number of different aspects to what you're saying. And history, I think, is really central to understanding how we can work these things out.
I've been speaking for an hour and a half, so I think we might continue beyond the sort of formal part. And do have a look at the books if you haven't already. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you all, Christian and Nick, for beautiful work and for sharing it with us tonight. Thank you.